Yellowstone was named a park in 1872. It was actually first discovered in 1807 by a man named John Coulter. Coulter was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he mustered out of that expedition on the way home and went back with some trappers in 1870. He went looking for Indians to trade with and passed through the park. The park was relatively calm for about 20 years after Coulter, and then the trappers came through in the 1820s to about 1840. Then prospectors in the 1860s, and people really began to wonder what was up there, so it was more formally explored in the early 1870s. And they convinced the government to set it aside as a pleasuring ground for the people in 1872. What my book is a collection of first-person accounts of travel to the park in its first 100 years. The earliest story in there is one of the mountain men, a guy named Osborne Russell, who kept an elaborate journal. So it's one of few documents where we really understand what people who visited the park early did. And I tried to collect stories that represented the range of experiences of people in the park. Osborne Russell is in the park with a trapping expedition, and these men are taking the day off. He's got a friend who's going to show him some of the natural wonders in the park because they're seeing things. So Russell isn't surprised when he sees the geysers, but this is what he said about it. After surveying these natural wonders for some time, my comrade conducted me to what he called our spring. At the spring, the first thing that attracts attention was a hole about 15 inches in diameter in which water was boiling slowly about 4 inches below the surface. At length it began to boil and bubble violently, and the water commenced rising and shooting upwards until the column rose to a height of 60 feet, from whence it fell into the ground in drops into a circle about 30 feet in diameter, perfectly cold when it hit the ground. So that's one of the very early descriptions of geysers. It's about 1839. It's remarkable, I think, that Russell doesn't have the word geyser. He doesn't know how to name this boiling fountain, but he's a great writer. He knows how to describe it. We can picture a geyser. Nobody knows exactly where Russell was, but apparently was at a geyser basin that's now defunct. But a geyser that, like Old Faithful, went off every hour. 3 things made your Yellowstone Park visit: watching the geysers, watching the falls, and then going to the dumps. When the hotels were built in the park in the 1880s, they just dumped their garbage out in the woods, and the bears discovered it pretty fast. So at twilight, the bears would come out and rummage around in the garbage, and the tourists would come out to watch the bears. The early encounters with bears were people hunting bears. Jack Bean was a very colorful guy. Bean came to Montana and worked as a trapper for a while. He was a meat hunter for the Army. When the Custer battle occurred, he was among the people who went to recover Custer's body, and later became a Yellowstone Park guide. And he was the guy you'd go to if you wanted to go hunting in the park. And in fact, he stayed a hunting guide after the park outlawed hunting and taking people into the surrounding areas to hunt her. Here's a story from 1877 when he guided a Confederate colonel into the park, and they're crossing the mountains, and Colonel Pickett wants to be a bear hunter. In fact, Colonel Pickett does become a famous bear hunter. Here's what Jack Bean said about Colonel Pickett getting his first bear. Now our trail left the ridge and descended down into the head of Tower Creek, where we saw another big bear on the trail coming toward us. So I told the colonel. There comes a bear. War, he answered. So I showed him. He got off his horse and walked quickly up the trail. I watched Mr. Bear and saw him leave the trail and start up a grassy hillside. I was afraid that the colonel would shoot at him when the bear was right above him. Then the bear would come down and use the colonel roughly. The colonel saw him when he was on the hillside about 30 yards away, so I dismounted and stepped behind the colonel. When the colonel shot the bear, it made a big growl and came down the hill on the run and passed within 30 feet. The colonel didn't know I was close behind him until I spoke. I told him to hold his fire until the bear jumped the creek, but he wouldn't do it. As the bear passed, the colonel shot and missed him. When the bear crossed the creek, I opened fire with my Winchester. By the time the colonel could load and was ready to shoot again, I'd put 5 Winchester balls into the bear. But the colonel gave him one last shot through the breast while the bear was falling. It rolled into the creek dead. Hunting was legal in Yellowstone Park from 1872 to 1886. When the park was established, it was felt that people would need to hunt for sustenance. That is, as I said, it was a roadless wilderness. So when they set up the park, they wanted to allow hunting. The idea was sustenance hunting, but trophy hunters soon came into the park looking for elk, moose, bears, and they were pretty much decimating all the game in the park. It's one of the reasons the Army took over administration of the park in 1886, was to get some people in there to police the park and take care of the wildlife. So there was an era there when hunting was out of control in the park. Eleanor Corthell was a woman who went to the park in 1903. So the park is becoming a pretty civilized place by 1903. There are good roads, there are hotels, but Eleanor decides that she wants to camp. She's not going to stay in the hotels. It's one of my favorite stories. Eleanor lived in Laramie, Wyoming, and she came home one day and told her husband to expect a bill, that she'd bought a team and a wagon, and she was taking their 7 children to Yellowstone Park. And she tells all sorts of marvelous stories about driving the wagon across Wyoming, corner to corner across Wyoming. It was quite a trip with these 7 kids, and how they learned to camp and hunt and fish and feed themselves and have adventures. And then one evening she decided to bake beans, and here's her encounter with the bears. The beans were not done at bedtime, so I put on more wood, thinking they would be just right for breakfast. It was so hot the stove was outside. About midnight there was a great clatter from the following stove. Sure enough, the bear had tipped it over trying to get to my beans. He was trying so hard to work the combination of the oven door that he failed to notice us in his excitement. Not till I threw things at him would he go away. On the whole, I presume, it would have been disappointing if only one bear at least had not paid us a visit. We never thought about being afraid, but I used all my ingenuity in hiding the bacon and sugar from prowling bears every night. And if you travel the park now and camp, you'll notice that there are bear safes where you can put your groceries away. The park will admonish you very strongly to keep your food locked up in your car or in one of the bear safes. But in this era, the bears wandered through the camps, got into the garbage cans, got into people's camps, and encounters with bears were very common. The earliest travelers to the park, the mountain men, were very cautious about Indians. Indians passed through the park. Jack Bean tells about one of his encounters with a band of Blackfeet, so that was common. By the time the park was settled, the Indians were rare. when it was named the park, the one band of Indians that lived there pretty regularly, the sheep eater band of the Shoshones, moved out of the park to a reservation then. But there is that great adventure in 1877 when the Nez Perce passed through the park, and that led to what I think is one of the most dramatic and best told stories of the park. That's Emma Cowan. Emma Cowan came to Montana as a little girl in the 1860s. Her father was a gold rusher, and she said she kept hearing stories about the park from the time she was a little girl and wanted to visit. Her father took her to Mammoth Hot Springs in the early 1870s, and there she heard about going to see the geysers. So when she married, she extracted a promise from her husband that he would take her to the geysers, and in 1877 he did. But that's the summer the Nez Perce left their reservation in eastern Washington and Idaho, trying to make their way to the buffalo country in Montana. Their plan was to go live with the Crow. They were giving up their homeland to do this. And one of the things that happened was that they found Emma Cowan and her tourist party. She was there with her husband, her sister, her brother, and several friends. The Indians came into the campground early in the morning, and the tourists decided they would just leave. So they packed up their wagons and headed out, and the Indians headed with them, just kind of surrounded them, escorting them along as they made their way out. And as they came along, they encountered another band of Indians, and here's what Emma says happened then. Suddenly, without warning, shots rang out. 2 Indians came dashing down the trail in front of us. My husband was getting off his horse. I wondered what the reason. I soon knew, for he fell. As soon as he reached the ground, he fell head downhill. Shots followed and Indian yells, and all was confusion. In less time than it takes to tell it, I was off my horse and by my husband's side, where he lay against a fallen pine tree. A pressure on my shoulder was drawing me away from my husband. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw an Indian with an immense Navy pistol trying to get a shot at my husband's head. Wrenching my arm from his grasp, I leaned over my husband, only to be roughly drawn aside. Another Indian stepped up. A pistol shot rang out. My husband's head fell back, and a red stream trickled down beneath his hat. Emma Cowan's account is, I think, one of the gems of Montana history. She wrote it 25 years after the events, so obviously these memories were really vivid to her. One of the things that you need to know is that George Cowan survived this. It's in another book that I'm working on. I'm working on a whole book on these encounters in Yellowstone Park in 1877. And George's story of coming to, discovering that he'd been shot 3 times, was unable to walk. And his first thought was for Emma. It's a touching story. And it's also a pretty dramatic story as he crawls 12 miles trying to find help before he's picked up by soldiers who are pursuing the Indians. When I put together the proposal for Adventures in Yellowstone, I had about 250 stories collected at that time. I've got closer to 400 now. I put the book together with the dozen best stories. I took the notion of adventures very seriously. I collected stories that where people really encountered some difficulty, had something interesting happen to them. A lot of the diaries you see of Yellowstone Park are nice descriptions of what happened and what they saw, but the Adventures in Yellowstone book really has people who had high adventures hunting bears or encountering Indians or falling in geysers, or maybe they had humorous things happen to them, like chasing a bear away from their campfire. So that's kind of the story of Adventures in Yellowstone.